No harm, no foul, my friend. No harm, no foul. Ladies and gentlemen, for about a decade, based on Tim's graciousness, I've been able to enjoy the privilege of presenting at advanced clinic after advanced clinic after advanced clinic as part of the Mount San Antonio College Summer Cross Country Series and occasionally at the Track and Field Series every January. So Mount SAC, LA84 Foundation have been incredibly gracious to me. I'm blessed to be a part of their great work. Tim has been just a fabulous colleague and a wonderful collaborator. So again, it's a blessing to be here, and I'll try to use your time and our time together as efficiently and as respectfully as I can. This is actually different for me. What Tim asked me to do is very distinct from what I've done in the advanced clinics that I referenced moments ago. And so I'm excited to do this. And as I always try to do whenever Tim offers me the opportunity to present, I will share extensive resources. I will share some resources that some of you, if you've ever been with me before, may have seen. And as always, however, I bring new resources. I bring new evidence to the endeavor. And so let me try to share a PowerPoint that I believe is available and ready for us. Okay, hopefully you all can see that. And I'm going to do this. At least I'm going to try to do this. There we go. There we go. Tim, hopefully that's working and we're in a good place. And so I'll proceed unless anyone instructs me to the contrary. So again, there's the title, ladies and gentlemen. Hopefully you've had a chance or an opportunity to take a brief look at the overview for the presentation. And so my goal in 30 to 40 minutes, 1,800 to 2,400 seconds, my goal during the presentation is simply to share a series of foundational concepts or themes that you can really assimilate and reflect upon. That is to say, I don't offer you an answer or answers, but I'll offer you a very specific template, for example, which you'll see later this evening, and you could utilize some or all of it to structure your foundational aerobic or endurance training endeavors. And all the resources that you'll see tonight, once again, are available with Tim and through Tim. So there's nothing that I have that you don't have access to. Maybe not at this moment, but certainly later tonight or in the future at your discretion. Everything I construct, every resource I evolve, any paper I look at that's evidence-based, you all have access to that now or in the future, okay? There's my contact information. Don't hesitate to contact me. You're always welcome to, and I enjoy the outreach that typically follows these interactions because it allows me to not only develop new relationships, but quite candidly, to be a continuous learner. And I will tell you selfishly, albeit always honestly, that when I engage in these interactions, one of my goals, my only selfish goal, is to be a continuous learner. I hope I share something that has instructive value for you. I know that I always learn, and so it's always a privilege to be part of these events. Again, LA84 Foundation does such good work. Here's a presentation overview. I don't read to my peers because I don't do that. And we will only look tonight at certain parts of this overview. Indeed, we're actually going to move ahead tonight and come back later, if you would please. When I say later, I mean in late March and early April, we'll come back to, for example, parts 5, 6, 7, and 8. Tonight, I want to focus primarily on part 9, 10, and eventually question discussion part 11. But I want to precede that by looking at, for example, parts 3 and part 4. I want to give you context for how I look at training, and hopefully that'll help inform what you do. And when I say inform, again, allow me to respectfully emphasize, you may disagree with my approach, and that's fine. If it helps you better refine what you do, then we all benefit from it. And that's a goal for all of us to benefit. I'll bypass the speaker background other than to say that, again, my background, as per Tim's very gracious introduction, is founded in evidence-based inquiry. My training is in the natural sciences, physiology, and biochemistry. And so all my PhD or doctoral work was in a laboratory setting, whether it was a biochemistry laboratory, a metabolic measurement laboratory. So everything I look at least everything I try to look at, begins with the question, is it evidence-based? Because that should inform, at least I would respectfully submit, that should inform what we do. And so I'm guided, for example, ladies and gentlemen, by the very prolific quotes, very prolific philosophies of some of our scientific forefathers, those who have preceded us, like Lord Kelvin. And indeed, you all know this individual, if not personally, at least by name, Sir Isaac Newton. And so again, I've been privileged to be around some giants in my academic training and my coaching experiences. And so I've tried to benefit from all the insight and all the experience, all the wisdom of those academic mentors, those coaching peers, as I've evolved through 2 decades plus in the coaching fraternity. That being said, here are a few questions just to help contextualize or perhaps frame our conversation tonight. And so I would ask you to think about a very foundational question, a most foundational question. You can see it there. I won't read it to my peers. I'll just give you a few seconds, if I could please, to look at it. And then I'll ask you a subsequent question, or at least I'll share a subsequent question, because I read a paper, if you would please, that was published within the last 12 months. And in that paper, published by a group of investigators from a laboratory in Australia, their experimental investigation identified 14 distinct thresholds. 14 distinct thresholds. So when you and I talk about threshold training, when you and I talk about a lactate threshold or an anaerobic threshold, call it what you will, that's, if you would please, a somewhat more subtle conversation than you might imagine originally. And so science helps guide us, but at some level, science does not help guide us. And so there's another question to frame our conversations as they evolve over these next 3 sessions. I would ask you this very foundational question: not do you, but should you? Do you, but should you? Because if you believe you should, then I would submit respectfully that you correspondingly assert, believe, or submit that there must be a performance-specific value and or a fitness-specific value that attends, for example, to resistance training. And notice, if you would, the use of the term resistance training. I didn't say weightlifting. I didn't say plyometric training. I didn't say stadium step ascensions or ascents. You can define resistance training in whatever manner you want to, and I'll, if you would please, explore that in greater detail over the next 3 weeks. And then a final question as we frame our conversation for this evening, for this Tuesday evening. What do you believe you're accomplishing when indeed you execute a long run? Again, I try to ask questions that might seem to be incredibly simple, but I hope that when you think about these foundational questions, they actually cause you to ask yourself, do I actually know that answer? Do I understand what I believe I'm achieving, what I hope to achieve, what stimulus I'm trying to induce or infuse when I undertake a so-called recovery distance run or a so-called long aerobic run? And so, again, we'll address that in some detail as we move forward. I'll bypass speaker background again at your discretion if you'd like to look at that. This is not a presentation about necessarily the Xavier College Preparatory or Desert Vista High School training programs or philosophies. There are elements of those philosophies, as you might predict or conjecture, but it's not a training presentation per se. If you want to have that conversation, if you'd like me to share any or all of the detail from prior NXN teams, I've had the privilege of accompanying 4 teams, 3 girls teams and 1 boys team to NXN over the last decade. If any of that's of value to you, I'll share every line of every day, of every week, of every month, of any and all programs that you want. So you can see exactly what we did through any and all of those seasons if you want to at another time. But that's not really the foundational focus this evening. Part of the focus this evening is training program philosophy. And so I would ask you not to, if you would please, assimilate or adopt the philosophy you'll see, but rather to reflect upon what I'll share with you in the very near term. And so, for example, I'll emphasize on this particular slide 2 elements from the 3 bullet points. Number 1, consistent cumulative, or if you prefer, cumulative consistent aerobic development. I would argue, and I'll try to make that argument quantitatively within the next few moments, that that is arguably the most integral or important component of a distance or endurance training program for a young student athlete. It is uncompromisingly foundational. It is absolutely non-negotiable. I would make that argument. I would share that contention for your consideration. And I would also tell you, with a greater element of specificity, that the approach that I utilize, and we have utilized across the 2 schools that Tim referenced and that I mentioned moments ago, the program or the approach we've utilized is sometimes referred to as a conjugate periodized or a conjugate periodization approach. And what that means, quite simply, for those who may benefit from a refresher or who have not been exposed to that, you've been exposed, for example, to linear periodization or nonlinear periodization, but not the term conjugate periodization. What that means in simplest terminology for your consideration is that we train every relevant performance quality throughout the year. And what I mean more specifically, if you think aerobic development, cardiovascular training, if you prefer, is important, we train it throughout the year. If you think there's a neuromuscular component that attends to optimizing performance potential or performance outcomes, we train that throughout the year. I'll show you how we train it. I'll introduce that tonight. We'll look at it in greater detail over the next 2 sessions, but we train every relevant quality throughout the year. So the model that someone who's a little bit older, and that would include this guy who's almost 60 years of age. Yes, as I get oh so close to that, if you would please, 60th birthday. I grew up in a time when the predominant model for periodization was that linear model, where you trained one specific quality during one specific phase, and then transition to another specific quality during a subsequent phase, and then again to perhaps a final or culminating quality during a third or final phase. That model, I think, is, if you would please, certainly traditional, but arguably insufficient for what we seek to do. So we use a conjugate model, and I'd invite you to think about that. Are all the elements of what you do present throughout the year? I'll pick one example. How about hill sprint training? For those who are endurance coaches, for those who are distance coaches and believe in hill sprints, I would ask you fundamentally, why do you believe? And if you do believe, when do you incorporate hill sprint training? At a certain point in a training cycle or phase, or throughout every training cycle, throughout every point in every training phase or cycle? Because I would argue, if you believe it to be valuable, it should always be there. And so that's the essence of conjugate periodization. And I would begin to frame our foundational conversation by, again, trying to challenge you, attempting to challenge you to think about what you believe to be important. I will share a template again later tonight before I conclude the presentation that will incorporate what I think are the relevant components of a foundational training program. I'll show you for about 30 seconds an advanced training template, one that we've utilized, for example, at Desert Vista High School, but that will not be a focus tonight. That may be a focus in 14 days or 14 evenings. We try to maintain consistency in our weekly patterns, in our phasic or phase patterns, in our seasonal patterns, and our annual patterns. We try to be very consistent. We try to individualize and emphasize continuous ongoing development, and we try to emphasize a philosophy of shared responsibility. I would argue that the best teams, indeed the best coaches, and I would argue those best coaches are always teachers. The best teachers I've been associated with, for example, those I've had the privilege and blessing of meeting at various NXN events over the better part of a decade, they are always committed to a philosophy of shared responsibility, where success, however defined, involves a shared responsibility between coach and student athlete and coach. I don't think you can escape that, and I think that's foundational to our teaching endeavor, to our coaching endeavor. And so I mentioned that as one of the foundational tenets or components of our coaching philosophy, all right? In terms of the art and science of training, let me share, if you would please, some additional thoughts with you. And so why would I argue, for example, whether you believe the argument, whether you subscribe to the argument, whether you counter the argument, why would I argue that cumulative, consistent aerobic development is absolutely critical? So those who know me well have seen this particular slide before. I borrowed it from Dr. Robert Chapman many years ago. And what you see here is a comparison contrast of a so-called classic model vis-a-vis or versus a so-called current model that models quantitatively or by percentage the energy demands, both aerobic and anaerobic, across a range of distances. And for tonight, I've chosen to focus on two-track distances, the 800-meter and 1,600-meter distances. And you can see here that over the evolution of approximately 4 decades of data-based or evidence-based science, there has been a fundamental, if you would please, realignment or a fundamental evolution in understanding of the relative aerobic and anaerobic demand that attends to each of the distances that are profiled in this particular slide. And in summary, what you see here is that since 1990, and I would argue that 1990 plus or minus is approximately the year in which this so-called current model began its evolution. Since 1990, what we've seen is access to more sophisticated experimental techniques. We've seen experimental studies that have incorporated a more robust or more robustly trained population of subjects, as opposed to quote unquote average or relatively sedentary subjects that may have characterized some of the earlier studies from the early 1980s, late 1970s, early 1970s. Better data. In summary, better data with no attempt to impugn those great investigators from the 1970s, for example, who gave us so many foundational data sets that will help provide the, if you would please, basis for our current understanding. In brief or in summary, what you see again is a greater appreciation, particularly within the last 30 years, for the aerobic contribution to optimal race performance at, for example, 800 meters, at, for example, 1,500 meters. And indeed, if you look Even at the 400-meter distance, you can see that the aerobic contribution is more than twofold greater than it was thought to be, for example, in the 1970s and 1980s. I'm not suggesting that an elite 400-meter competitor should be engaging in, for example, 6 to 10 mile runs on a regular basis to develop her or his quote unquote aerobic potential. That's not my suggestion. Rather, that there is a significant aerobic component even at 400 meters, and the art of training, as contrasted to the science that you see profiled before you, the art of training involves answering questions like, what do I do to develop, if you would please, the aerobic potential or aerobic capacity of a 400-meter competitor? Because, for example, daily or near daily 6 to 10 mile runs would likely suboptimize development for that 400-meter competitor. So again, I go back before I move forward. I said that our philosophy is predicated upon, it is grounded in foundationally a commitment to continuous cumulative aerobic development. There's the evidence summarized very nicely for you that covers multiple decades of scientific studies. There's the evidence that underlies the approach that we take. I'm not suggesting that you subscribe to it. I'm not suggesting you counter-argue it, but I want to give you that perspective as we move ahead, okay? All right, so that being said, what I'm going to do now, actually, after I share this slide with you, is I'm going to move ahead relatively prolifically to section 9 on this PowerPoint resource. What I share with you here is what I call or refer to as harmless Messer artwork. This is something I did on a Friday night and a Saturday night many years ago, before I met my wonderful wife and before I had my young daughter. I used to spend too many Fridays and Saturdays in the evenings, at night, if you would please, engaging in artwork that might be, if you would please, uploaded to a PowerPoint resource. So what this shows you in summary is that, if you would please, endurance performance potential, broadly conceived, is a reflection of not only VO2 max, which is otherwise referred to as maximal aerobic capacity. We'll talk about that, albeit to a lesser degree tonight, and in greater detail next Tuesday and the Tuesday after. It's also a function of so-called threshold, commonly referred to as lactate threshold, and also a function or reflection of so-called running economy. And those contributing factors, if you would please, those characteristics, maximal aerobic capacity, threshold or lactate threshold, and running economy, are all embodied here. And what they show you in summary, and I chose the 5-kilometer distance to model this example. I could have chosen any of those prior distances, 800 meters, 1,600 meters. What this shows you in the left region of this particular illustration is that really that individual who has the most, if you would please, robust combination of aerobic capacity, threshold, and running economy is very likely to be the most accomplished endurance performer. Framed quite differently, or framed somewhat differently, when you and I think about program design, when we think about that so-called consistent development of young student athletes, I would ask you to ask yourself the question, is it important for me to develop VO2 max or maximal aerobic capacity? Is it important for me to develop threshold, or more specifically lactate threshold? Is it important for me to enhance running economy? Because if you answer yes, for example, to all 3 questions, then you need training interventions or modalities that allow you to do that. You need specific workouts that amplify those characteristics or develop those characteristics. And so again, this is a bit more of an advanced, if you would please, iteration, and we will evolve toward this over the next 2 weeks. But with that preview, with that appetizer, if you will, what I'd like to do is move ahead, if you would please, not to part 5, because this is the evidence-based portion of a presentation that you'll begin to see next Tuesday and will culminate in 2 weeks. So not part 5, where you can see, if you would please, data set after data set after data set. Indeed, more data than perhaps anyone besides myself could ever want. And so not part 6, where we look at lactate threshold and try to provide some insight into why we might train, how we might improve lactate threshold. So not part 6 tonight, if you would please. And again, always evidence-based. Not part 7, running economy. And I would simply, if you would please, tantalize you, at least attempt to tantalize you, by arguing that running economy, what some term efficiency, but is better termed running economy, is one of the most trainable characteristics that you and I will come across, not only in young endurance athletes or distance runners, but indeed across the spectrum of endurance athletes or distance runners. But again, tonight we won't look at that evidence. We'll come back to that if you would please. That's a more advanced conversation. We'll entertain that within the next 2 weeks, and we'll look at some specific training modalities you might consider incorporating. And then finally, before we arrive at part 9, part 8, I asked you earlier, what do you believe you accomplish if and when you execute a so-called long aerobic run? This particular section, part 8, is indeed evidence-based and addresses some of the, if you would please, adaptive outcomes that can associate with a long run. So we look at goals, we look at outcomes, and we do that from the prior evidence-based foundation. So we'll come back to that. But for now, what I'd like to do, and allow me to bring up my phone and just check time here because I want to honor your time and I want to leave time for questions. Allow me to share with you, if you would please, and I'll stop sharing in a moment this PowerPoint resource. Allow me to share with you 2 bi-weekly plans. One we'll look at for just 30 seconds. That's the advanced plan that we'll evolve toward in the next 2 weeks. And then the foundational plan that I'd like to focus on this evening before we entertain a question and answer conversation. So again, look at the goals that I list before you. And you've seen these before. I mentioned consistent cumulative aerobic development. I've called it aerobic power development in this particular slide. That relates to cardiovascular development. We'll also speak to neuromuscular development as we look at this two-week template. And then I'll speak to what I refer to as athlete development, and I'll provide a definition or a context for that momentarily, all right? So again, I've got an advanced training cycle, I've got a foundational training cycle, and those are included in 2 MS Excel resources. Allow me to stop sharing right now this PowerPoint resource and to share the first of those 2 Excel resources. And so I know I can find it promptly here if you can indulge me. And so don't let this scare you. Don't let this scare you when you see it. And so hopefully you can all see now this so-called advanced template, all right? And again, Tim has this, he can share it. But you see here in this advanced template, it's a 2-week or 14-day template, and you can see multiple training components. This may or may not apply to you ever. This may seem almost overwhelming to those of you who have minimal backgrounds as distance coaches. That's okay. This is not our focus tonight. It need not be your focus next Tuesday or in 2 weeks. You can use any or all of it depending on what you decide to be important. And so I'll just give you one example. You see the reference to plyometrics here. Plyos by abbreviation. I will argue at some point next Tuesday or the Tuesday after that plyometric training is a very robust intervention to enhance running economy, and that there's now in excess of 2 decades of very good data, including a new paper published just yesterday. So again, we always try to stay current, and that paper fully corroborates 2 decades plus of data suggesting, if you would please, that plyometric training enhances running economy. And if you believe what I shared moments ago, that, for example, improved running economy can enhance endurance or distance running performance, then you may have an interest ultimately or in the future in incorporating plyometric training if you don't already do it, okay? But again, that's a future consideration. Let me stop sharing this resource and share the resource that I really want to emphasize tonight, if I can find it. And I feel like I'm on a roll here in terms of sharing resources. So let me share the one of primary interest. And so here it is. This one should look different. This one should look very different than the one you saw moments ago, all right? And so I call it foundational. I call it varsity boys, but I have no universal definition for the word varsity. That may vary dramatically depending on the nature of your program. And so, indeed, we've got a 2-week cycle here. You can see week 1, you can see week 2, and I'm going to try to emphasize some key points over the next 8 to 12, perhaps 15 minutes, and then I'm going to transition to a conversation with all of you. And so, key themes. First of all, do you need to train in the morning? No, you do not. This could all, that is to say, all these morning training sessions could be, for example, conducted in the afternoon. Okay, so nothing special about that. I just did that because it's so common for us in Arizona to conduct morning training sessions consequent to the environment that we live in. All right, so don't be misled by that. So that being said, here is a hypothetical sequence during week 1 that includes a moderate intensity distance run, includes what you see here referred to as track strides and stadium step ascents, and then includes some athlete development training that on this Monday involves hurdle mobility and so-called lunge plank matrix training. So in the case of these 2 examples indicated via the black or dark font, I would ask you now, I would invite you all to begin to think about how do you envision so-called supplemental or ancillary or athlete development training? How do you envision the training that you might incorporate to, if you would please, build a better, more resilient athlete or student athlete who can tolerate over, for example, 208 weeks or 4 years in a high school program, greater and greater and greater volumes of training safely and without incremental risk of injury? And so in our program, for example, one of those components is hurdle mobility training, okay? All right, so again, without going through 14 days, again, let me try to highlight key themes. Recovery distance runs. At a foundational level, I would argue that relaxed recovery distance runs should be an integral component of a training program. Indeed, I would even submit respectfully, they should be an integral component of an advanced training program at the high school level. And so if you're wondering about the intensity of a so-called recovery or relaxed distance run, stay with me. I'll share that with you before we're done tonight. I have some, if you would please, new slides that even Mr. O'Rourke has not seen before, because again, I always try to introduce something new for all of you. Notice another theme, if I could please, without reading every day to my peers. Track strides on Monday, track strides on Tuesday, track strides on Wednesday, track strides on Thursday. Notice that our student athletes are moving quickly or moving fast almost every single day. Even athletes, even student athletes at a relatively early stage of development are moving their feet fast, are moving their legs quickly almost every day. I think that's critically important. And that is an example of what I term or describe as a neuromuscular focus. You can have the most robust cardiovascular system on the planet, if I can utilize that terminology. But if you don't have the neuromuscular development or preparation to support that cardiovascular capacity, what you'll do is run relatively slowly for a very long distance. And so endurance training is a cardiovascular neuromuscular phenomenon. For you and I, who seek to optimize the development of our student athletes at the high school level and prepare them to go on or evolve, for example, to potential undergraduate running experiences, I would argue respectfully, we need to train the cardiac system, the vascular system, the neural system, and the muscular system, all four. It is a cardiovascular neuromuscular phenomenon. So our feet move fast. If I can quote my good friend John O'Malley from Illinois, our feet move fast essentially every day. At the varsity level in an advanced program, our feet move fast every single day. At a foundational level, you see here, their feet move fast on most days, okay? You can see here a workout, just one workout at this very foundational level. I have a moderate intensity run. I've got a higher intensity so-called threshold run. I invoke the example in week 1 of this 2-week training cycle of a progression or progressive run. In other words, select a distance. How about a 2-mile progression run? So I'll break that into 4 800-meter or half-mile components, and each 800-meter or each half-mile component, that student athlete will attempt to run progressively faster with a set of structured quote-unquote splits or goal splits that allow she or he to become faster throughout the, if you would please, evolution of that 2-mile run. That's one form of what I would refer to as so-called threshold running, which can enhance or contribute to amplified aerobic development. And so again, at a very foundational level, you might consider one so-called workout per week and then one so-called medium long or long aerobic run. In week 1 of this 2-week model, I call it a medium long run. And I emphasize, for example, the inclusion or incorporation of multiple ascents or hills. And so just to give you some definitional specificity, because I know of no universal definition, what might be a medium long run by definition? It might be, for example, 12 to 17% of your total weekly volume. Let me just articulate that to allow you to go back now, go into your, for example, weekly training volume and think about what aspect or what component a medium long run might occupy and how much volume that would mean for your various varsity level student athletes or non-varsity student athletes for that matter. Okay, you see here, for example, reference to cross training. I think cross training, non-running training can also contribute very prolifically to developing aerobic capacity or aerobic power in young student athletes. So I invoke that example on one day, if you would please. And so this particular example of week 1 has an individual on the ground running 4 to 5 times, 5 to 6 times per week, 5 to 6 times per week on the ground. And then finally in week 1, you see reference to so-called core X training. I'll make a Core X resource available for those who are not familiar with that terminology. That is from my good friend, who some of you know and perhaps follow, Jay Johnson. That's a 5-minute core training routine, 5 minutes, twice a week. I will also make available so-called general strength training routines. They're actually included as appendices within the PowerPoint resource I've already sent to Tim and that you looked at earlier this evening. General strength training is designed to be running specific body weight based training. Let me say that again, running specific body weight based training. I will submit to you that when you train, for example, relatively, if you would please, relatively new distance runners, those who don't have, if you would please, significant backgrounds, those who might be relatively new or entirely new to our sport, that you might consider invoking or infusing body weight based resistance training into your program, if you would please, for that student athlete cohort in particular. That might be an appropriate precursor or prerequisite to, for example, weight room based resistance training. I'm not suggesting you can't go into the weight room on day one. If that's your philosophy, then I'm not suggesting you are mistaken or incorrect. I am suggesting, however, that when you think about, again, that most foundational level of development, there may be a very intentional progression that evolves from body weight to externally resisted, quote unquote, weightlifting, for example. That might allow you to, if you would please, transition through increasingly challenging resistance training in a manner that minimizes the risk of any musculoskeletal impairment or injury. So we include a number of body weight based, if you would please, quote unquote, athlete development modalities, lunge plank matrix, multiple lunge movements, and multiple, if you would please, planks. And those are combined in a sequence that allows us to, again, use body weight to try to develop movement patterns, to try to develop strength that hopefully contributes to amplifying the development of that athlete at a musculoskeletal level and strengthens him for that evolution through 208 weeks of a high school distance running experience. Okay? And then in week 2, ladies and gentlemen, just to try to give you ideas, if you would please, you can see some commonality here. In week 2, in our 14-week cycle, we do a threshold run. We call it a tempo run. What's the difference between a progression run and a tempo run? I know of no universal definitions. In our program, a tempo run is a relatively harder or more robust effort at a consistent or constant pace, okay? So if we assign 2 miles of tempo running, those, if you would please, miles would be carried out at the same pace. 2 miles at 6-minute pace, so a 12-minute tempo run or 12-minute threshold run, okay? The commonality across the 2 weeks is that you see, again, moving our feet quickly or moving our legs quickly is common, if you would please. You see the same athlete development modalities. Notice in the second week, cross-training and cross-training. So within a 14-week cycle, you see three, if you would please, days that may or may not include cross-training. You might opt, instead of running on the ground, to include or substitute a cross-training session. The goal being to ensure that, at least to the best of our ability, to ensure that the overall musculoskeletal loading is constructive and not destructive. And that, of course, will vary likely for each and every student athlete. Some of your, if you would please, young student athletes with minimal backgrounds may be able to run on the ground 12 times within 14 days. Others may run on the ground 8 times in 14 days. And so that's, if you would please, the art of what you and I do. But in this 2-week template, I'm trying to give you a 2-week cycle that allows you some of that latitude to make informed decisions about whether on a Tuesday, for example, a recovery run on the ground is desirable and optimal relative to a non-weight bearing cross-training session, such as, for example, a cycling session, an aqua training session, or for those who have access, a so-called ultra-gravity treadmill session. We'll talk about ultra-gravity treadmill training later, if you would please, this month and early next month. And then finally, on Saturday in that second week, a longer aerobic run that's, if you would please, flat in nature, does not incorporate, if you would please, very quote unquote intentionally, a group of hills or a set of hills or a series of hills. And so what's a long run? Once again, I know of no universal definition. How might I guide you? How might I remind you, for those who have some background? A long run, at least as I've been exposed to it, for those who run, for example, 5 to 6 days per week, a long run might encompass 20 to 25% of your total weekly volume. So if you had a student athlete running 300 minutes per week, she or he might execute a long run on the order of 60 minutes. Okay. And again, I'm not telling you that's definitive, nor am I suggesting it's even evidence-based, because I think long runs indeed are a great example of where science meets art and art meets science, if I might utilize that analogy or that example. I know of no definitive evidence that suggests that there's an ideal distance for a long run. I've certainly heard individuals make that statement, but typically I can address such a statement from an evidence-based perspective relatively quickly. So again, put it all together before I go back to the PowerPoint for just a few moments to bring us to a conclusion and elicit a question and answer session. Here's a model for you to think about when you think about how to construct, if you would please, a training cycle for a young student athlete who's perhaps relatively new in our sport. If that student athlete is going to execute a 10-week season or a 12-week season, you might envision 5 to 6 2-week cycles. And this would allow you to address both the cardiovascular and the neuromuscular emphases that I submit to you are critical, indeed are foundational to the aggregate or comprehensive development of a young student athlete, and for that matter, a more advanced student athlete, okay? So with that all being said, if you would please, again, I go back to the example of a recovery distance run or a relaxed distance run. What does that mean? What does that mean? How fast is that run, Jeff? Because it's nice to hear a term recovery or relaxed, but what does that actually mean in practice? Allow me, if I could, before I conclude, to go back to that PowerPoint resource. So I'll stop sharing this. And once again, I emphasize this is available for your access with Tim. You can certainly contact me if you'd like to get it from me. Either way is fine. But let me come back to the PowerPoint one last time and share that. And so now, if I can, I'll proceed. Determining training intensity. My last focus tonight before we engage in any question and answer at your discretion, if you would please. How do you determine or specify exercise intensity? What does recovery mean? What does relaxed mean? What does threshold mean? Let me give you some insight, all right? And so many of you have come across, perhaps, the so-called Borg scale, the classic scale that relates rating of perceived exertion, or for that matter, perhaps the modified Borg scale. I'll focus primarily on the so-called Borg scale, rating of perceived exertion. And ironically, I shouldn't say ironically, coincidentally, there was a review paper published within the last 2 weeks, and it looked at paper citations across the last approximate 4 decades. What's the most cited paper in the exercise science literature across the last 4 decades? Gunnar Borg's classic paper detailing rating of perceived exertion and the Borg scale. The most cited paper in the scientific literature. And indeed, rating of perceived exertion, subjective assessment of perceived exertion relates very intimately and very precisely to the physiological stress, and I utilize the term stress in a positive context, the physiological stress or challenge of the training that you and I design for our student athletes. So the Borg scale, all right, there it is, all right, there it is. And so you see those terms, and you might be able to utilize those terms, but you need some comparative context. You need some additional comparative context. And so I just want to set that foundation tonight, all right? Because you might ask, well, Jeff, do I want my recovery run to be very, very light or fairly light or somewhat hard for that matter? You could ask that question. And so again, you see on a scale from essentially 6 to 20, in the classic Borg scale, you see 7 descriptors ranging from very, very light to very, very hard. How do we utilize those effectively, ladies and gentlemen? All right. And there's the reference for those who want that. If you would please, whenever I share, if you would please, any scientific framework, any data, I always provide the reference. And certainly for anyone who contacts me, if you want to read the classic paper from the early 1980s from Gunnar Borg, I'll be glad to make it available to you. That's not a problem. Okay. Again, for those who want to explore rating of perceived exertion in greater detail, here's a very elegant internet site from the Harvard School of Public Health. This is well done. And for those who've never explored the Harvard School of Public Health internet site, I resoundingly encourage you to explore that internet site, whether you want to address macronutrient requirements, micronutrient requirements, forms of physical activity. It's a brilliant, an elegant, and an evidence-based internet resource that I think would benefit all of you. So I mentioned it very briefly, all right? I'll bypass the modified Borg scale because the modified Borg scale, ladies and gentlemen, to my knowledge, and correct me if you think I'm mistaken, the modified Borg scale was designed to be utilized with individuals who have some form of respiratory challenge, such as chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Okay, so for us, with the majority of our student athletes, perhaps the Borg scale provides more predictive ability. And so what Tim's not seen before for me, what, if you would please, any of Tim's colleagues at Mount SAC or L84 Foundation have not seen from me before, is what I'll show you now. I did some investigation to try to contextualize more broadly this issue of assigning exercise intensity. And I found a very nice resource that somehow eluded me. It must have been when I spent all those years as a department chair and I became so immersed in leadership endeavors that I committed that cardinal sin of drifting away from the evidence-based endurance training literature. And so I'm guilty. But now I'm back as full-time faculty. I'm teaching 8 classes this semester. For example, I taught 8 classes in the fall. So like those of you who are teachers, I'm fully re-engaged in the teaching and learning endeavor. And so I had some time to explore, and I found this resource, and I took the occasion to design this for myself and for all of you. And so I'll share with you 5 tables, all right? Sedentary, defined as individuals who are chronically, indeed entirely inactive, at least largely inactive. That doesn't apply to your endeavor with your student athletes. But how about, and I'll go through them quickly, then I'll come back and, if you would please, go through them more slowly. How about light, moderate, vigorous, and high intensity activity? I designed these tables for all of you, and what I did, for example, there's your RPE of 8 to 10. So light activity, an RPE of 8 to 10, and there's a descriptive measure. If that helps you contextualize, if you would please, how to relate, for example, RPE to, for example, aerobic activity, there's, if you would please, a relational tool. And next week, and 14 days from tonight, or 2 weeks from tonight, we'll actually look at, for example, VO2 max. For those who've ever wondered, how do I, if you would please, extrapolate or extend percentages of VO2 max to my exercise intensity prescription or training prescription? Now you'll have a tool within these tables that allows you to, for example, draw a parallel between a percentage of VO2 max and rating of perceived exertion, not to mention a corresponding descriptive measure. How about moderate intensity physical activity? Again, percentage of VO2 max, RPE, and a descriptive measure of moderate intensity physical activity. I would argue, ladies and gentlemen, that with very foundationally developed, with very, if you would please, lightly developed, or individuals in the early stages of their aerobic development, that your primary focus should be on light and moderate aerobic endeavor. I didn't say exclusive, but primary, light and moderate aerobic endeavor, all right? So if you begin to look in some of the endurance training literature or science and begin to think about percentages of VO2 max, I'm talking about percentages from 20 to 40 up to 60% of VO2 max. I'm talking about rating of perceived exertion anywhere from 8 to 13. I'm talking about, if you would please, durations of running from, for example, 30 to 60 minutes. More vigorous aerobic training, what you and I might call, for example, threshold training, for those who are wondering. If you put an athlete through a threshold training session and you're on a bike next to that athlete and she or he is executing a threshold training session and you're trying to ascertain, you're looking for some feedback as to how that session is evolving. You might ask them for a sense of their effort level, and you can compare that to an RPE scale. You don't have to do it right now. You can compare it to 14 to 16 on the RPE scale. Look at the descriptors. Look at the descriptors that, for example, are reflected within that range from 14 to 16, if you would please. That'll help you capture, for example, the feedback you'd like when you're trying to gain subjective input from an individual executing a threshold run. So you can guide him, so you can guide her productively throughout the entirety of that threshold or more vigorous training session, all right? And again, threshold training likely takes place somewhere between 60 and 85% of VO2 max, depending on the developmental level of your student athlete. And then, if you would please, so-called high intensity training, and certainly the term high intensity interval training, for example, has regained, it hasn't gained, it's regained traction in the experimental literature and in the applied endurance community in the last 15 years. It was 2006 when a paper was published by a group of investigators from a Canadian laboratory that really regalvanized this conversation and has led to this focus on so-called HIIT, or high intensity interval training. You might associate that with RPE values of 17 or higher, intensities that cannot be maintained for example, more than 8 to 9 to 10 minutes, and percentages of VO2 max, 85, 90, 95, 100, even beyond 100% of VO2 max, okay? And so I hope these tables are not tables that you necessarily feel comfortable with at this very moment. But what I invite you to do now is the following, before I take your questions or engage with you. What I invite you to do is perhaps twofold, not only as a reflection on tonight's session, but in preparation for Tuesday night of next week. I invite you, number one, to go back and look at that 2-week training template, okay? Look at that, think about that, and how that might fit or not fit. Think about how you understand or don't understand that template, and then bring questions that might help you clarify your understanding and refine your program development. I would invite you secondly to look at these tables in greater detail and reflect upon these tables at your discretion. Whether you acquire them from Tim as he posts them to the internet, whether you contact me tomorrow or later this week and acquire them directly from me, I would invite you to look at these tables and think about the approach you use to quantify intensity, whether it's the intensity of a so-called recovery run, the intensity of a so-called threshold training session, the intensity of a so-called medium-long or long aerobic run. What are you seeking to achieve? How do you teach your student athletes when you impart that verbiage to them as they envision that weekend long run or that midweek threshold session? So that would be my invitation to you. And I think with that said, I'll transition if I can stop sharing, and I'll do that right now if Tim will allow me to do that, and bear with me here, at least allow me to try to do that. I will stop sharing and I will transition now, Tim, if I may, to any and all questions. At least I'll attempt to the best of my modest ability to address any and all questions that you would like me to do.
Thank you very much, Jeff. We have several questions for you at all different levels. But before we do that, I don't remember you being this funny. That's pretty good.
Fleeting attempts, Tim. Fleeting attempts at humor.
There you go. You dropped so many hints and intriguing responses to join us the next 2 weeks. I thought I was watching an episode of The Bachelor. So anyway, very good. So let me tell you, the first thing that came up, when you said there are 14 thresholds, the list of questions looked like a slot machine. It was rolling fast. So the biggest question, I guess, the one here is, do I need to know all of them? Which ones? And how many really matter?
Well,
how much time do you have?
That's a great question, or those are great questions. Let me tell you that I don't know them all, and I don't know that they all matter. First of all, and the reason this is of interest to us, and let me try to contextualize this and answer it succinctly. The idea that there's some universal threshold, and that you and I as coaches, we as coaches are seeking to specify that intensity, and if you would please, execute a run or a workout at that intensity in practice or practices on a periodic basis, is perhaps not ingenuous, okay? The demarcation or identification of a threshold is going to be specific, for example, to the experimental technique within a laboratory setting that is utilized to identify a threshold. And that's why in this particular paper, it comes from Dr. David Bishop's laboratory, for those who are interested. I believe the first author on the paper is a gentleman by the name of Cesare Granata, and I have the paper. I'm glad to share it with you for anyone who wants it. But again, what does it mean for our purposes, if you would please? What it means to us, I think, is this, particularly with foundational level student athletes. We might think about 1 to 2 sessions every 2 weeks that are so-called threshold sessions. And those sessions should be, for example, and I'll go to language that I think is very conducive to, again, individuals at a foundational level. Those sessions should be comfortably hard. And for those who think, I've heard that term before, you should have. One of my close friends is Dr. Jack Daniels, and I'm not referencing a beverage for those who don't know Dr. Daniels. One of my good friends is Dr. Jack Daniels, and Jack, many years ago, coined the term, if you would please, comfortably hard. And so I think one of your challenges as you think about the science of endurance training and try to apply it to student athletes is to try to find, through a period of, quite frankly, initial trial and error. And that's okay in the very initial stages of the development of a student athlete. When he or she or he first joins your program, you want to try once, perhaps twice every 2 weeks, to challenge that individual to execute a harder effort, a comfortably hard effort of 1.5 miles, of 2 miles, eventually longer, for example. And so I won't tell you to try to find 75% of VO2 max, but I will tell you that the verbiage included within the RPE scale, I think can be valuable. Yes, a relatively hard effort that can be sustained for 2 miles, I think is, for example, a good guideline. And I'll give you another guideline that I've always utilized with my student athletes, even at the highest varsity level, even with all those different NXN teams, girls and boys. One of the teaching tools I've always invoked and infused with my student athletes at that advanced level is when you finish a threshold run, and that would typically be 3 to 4, maybe 4 to at most to 5 miles, maybe 5 miles in the case of a Danny Jones, who was probably the most advanced high school athlete I ever had. In a 3 to 5 mile threshold run, you should finish that run and still be able to run an extra or an additional half mile at that same movement velocity. So if you arrive at the end of a 3 mile threshold run and you're absolutely exhausted, that's not a threshold run. That's not a threshold run. Okay. So you don't need to know 14 thresholds. You shouldn't even expect yourself to be able on day 1 or even day 10 or even day 21 to identify a specific, if you would please, pace that is threshold pace. But what you should be evolving toward continuously, whether it's in that first 3 weeks, that first season, that first year, is a range. And so the final comment I'll make in responding to the first question is, even now with the most advanced runner in the Desert Vista program, his name is Noah Jodan. When he does his threshold runs, a typical threshold run for him is 4 miles at about 5:20 per mile. That seems to be about right, but we'll give him a range on any given morning from 5:15 to 5:25. So again, we're not looking for a magic number, if I can draw that analogy. We're looking for a range within which he can run at a sustained, relatively constant velocity and challenging himself aerobically to continuously enhance his aerobic development. Does that help? I hope that does.
Well, that was excellent. Very well put. A lot of you keep asking the same question: when can I see the video? And with all the stuff that Jeff has been talking about, it's always so helpful to be able to review it. Well, we will have those up. We did mention that we have a brand new website. We're working on it feverishly, and within hopefully a week or so, we're going to have all of this up. But if you would like the presentation or the Excel files, you can email Jeff or myself, and we'll email those right back to you right away. So we can get that out to you. And then the videos, again, we'll have up hopefully within a week or so. All right, Jeff, several more questions. Let's see if we can get through a few more. We have about 15 minutes here. All right, in the cumulative consistent aerobic development, all right, is it the same importance for old runners, or excuse me, older new runners, or multi-sport athletes, or just young undeveloped runners?
I would argue it's critical for both. And I would argue it's always critical. I would argue it's critical, for example, for an athlete in the Bowerman Track Club. And I would argue it's critical for a freshman student athlete in a high school track and field or cross country program. Because again, if you go back to that data set, those 2, if you would please, rows of data I showed you from that early PowerPoint slide, what you see is, and again, challenge me if you think my interpretation of the data is perhaps flawed or disingenuous. What I think is compellingly demonstrated, particularly within the last 3 decades of 30 years, is that at 800 meters, at 2 miles, at 5,000 meters, at 10,000 meters, at the marathon distance, all those distances demand very prolific aerobic development if the goal is to optimize performance. And so that's the caveat I interject. And I think with young runners, young student athletes, one of our goals is to continuously improve performance, and aerobic power or maximal aerobic capacity, call it VO2 max for those who like that language, call it what you will, but aerobic power or aerobic development is highly trainable, particularly at that young age, Now, when you say older runners, certainly I can invoke the example, and I'll do it without being too, if you would please, excessively wordy, I hope. I remember all too vividly when a good friend of mine, a gentleman by the name of Dr. Joe Vigil, and many of you know that name, I remember the first time that Joe shared data on Dina Castor, who I believe is our most recent medal winner at the marathon distance in the Olympics. And Dina, in the last several years of her career, if I recall the data set correctly, did not show an ongoing increase in her maximal aerobic capacity. So at the highest levels, elite endurance athletes in the latter stages of a career, you might not see VO2 max or aerobic development being further enhanced, but that doesn't mean you can't improve lactate threshold and running economy. Okay, so there may be, if you would please, an exception that may fit your definition of older runners. But if we're talking about a senior in high school versus a freshman in high school, I would argue aerobic development is primary. It is the foundation for all student athletes who participate in the so-called distance events at the high school level.
Excellent. Let's get some nuts and bolts questions in here real quick here.
Please.
All right. How fast are track strides? How fast?
Great question. Great question. So let me give you some specific examples, and you can amend those because there's no universal answer, but I'll give you some very specific answers. So with our 4 NXN teams, the 3 girls teams and the 1 boys team, what we would do in cross country, and I will transition to track because I know it's track season, but just to give you a foundational basis, in track, we would begin strides in late May, early June at the inception of our cross country training. And those strides would typically be at 5-kilometer goal pace in late May, early June. Now, by contrast, in mid to late November, so 5 to 5.5, almost 6 months later, those strides would be at 15 to 1600 meter goal pace, with a few of those strides being at 800 meter goal pace. So we would systematically advance the intensity of those strides across a prolonged period, such as 5 to 5.5, maybe even 6 months, from, for example, late May to early December in NXN. Same approach in track. The only difference being in track, if you would please, because the distances we race are typically 3,200 meters, 1,600 meters, and or 800 meters. Typically in track, we would begin our strides, if you would please, with a combination of 5K goal pace and 3,200 meter goal pace in, for example, December. And so by January, if you would please, we're already doing 3,200 meter and 1,600 meter goal pace strides. And by late February, we're already doing 800 meter goal pace strides. So we just accelerate that quote unquote timetable or that transition. We accelerate that transition, no pun intended, in the track season to account for the more specific neuromuscular demand of the 800 meter distance relative to, for example, 5 kilometers in the fall. Okay, does that help?
Boy, that's great. That's our good friend Ken Reeves. That's what he always says, is that I need to have the body do something at the speed I need the body to run. In other words, how fast I need to be running at that time. So that
absolutely
goes what you're talking about. Yeah. All right, here's a great one here. All right, can you explain the benefit of doing hurdle mobility drills after the workout as opposed to including them as part of the warm-up?
That's a great question. I don't know that I can explain, or I don't know that I can argue or submit to you that the positioning you speak to during the warm-up as compared to after the workout, I don't know that I can submit to you that one is superior to the other. So what I would respond with is the following, that when you think about inserting any given modality, such as hurdle mobility training, into a training session, when you think about inserting it, think about what you're trying to accomplish. And so 2 examples, during the warm-up, after the training session. During the warm-up, if you insert hurdle mobility training, you might be trying to indeed evolve the process of warm-up per se. You might be trying to elevate internal temperature, elevate sweat rate, elevate cardiac output, elevate heart rate. And so hurdle mobility training or hurdle mobility drills are one component of a broader warm-up that could contribute to that series of metabolic and whole body transitions that you and I typically describe as a warm-up. Okay, why do we include hurdle mobility training after the training session? I have a good friend, and I may be biased. He's a physical therapist, and he said to me many years ago, Jeff, if I could just get every coach of every distance athlete who comes in here to do a hurdle mobility training with 3 or 4 movements twice a week, we could diminish injury incidence by 50% or more. And so for us, hurdle mobility training is an injury prevention intervention or modality. That's our primary focus. That doesn't mean it can't be a warm-up intervention or modality. We just use it differently. We have a different type of warm-up that does not incorporate hurdle mobility. So in summary, I would argue that you could use it in either position or perhaps even both places. It always comes back to the goal you're trying to achieve, whether the goal is within a warm-up, as a component of a warm-up, or as an injury prevention intervention. Okay?
Very good. We got a couple more quick ones in here. Let's do this. Do you recommend any work at max velocity within the distance program?
Absolutely. And so I thank you for looking ahead 7 to 14 days. You will see in that advanced or 2-week template. And again, Tim can share that at his discretion, even though we haven't arrived at Tuesday of next week or 2 weeks from tonight yet. He can share that at his discretion. I'll share it if you reach out to me, for example, tomorrow or later this week. We try to engage in max velocity training both on the track and on the hills. For example, 3 to 5 times in every 2-week training cycle. So I think it's critical. And again, as per the prior inquiry, I said that, at least I submitted respectfully, that where you include hurdle mobility should be a function of your goal orientation or your purpose. The same applies to max velocity training. Why would you include max velocity training? You don't include it, for example, because someone told you that they heard it at the Boulder Running Clinic. Even though I love the Boulder Running Clinic, like I love L84 Foundation and Mount Sac. You don't do it for that reason. You do it because it has a purpose. And so here's one potential reason for including max velocity training. I include max velocity training because that's a training modality that allows me to maximize muscle fiber recruitment. And only by maximizing muscle fiber recruitment periodically and consistently can I train those muscle fibers to be available for recruitment during a competitive endeavor. There's a rationale. So we do it. We try to introduce it, and I'll give you just a simplistic overview, if you would. We might do flying 30s. You've likely heard that term, many of you, and some of you probably utilize flying 30s. We might utilize flying 30s eventually with our freshmen, flying 40s with our sophomores, and so on and so forth. We might even build up to 50s, if you would please. And some of you would dispute whether you can truly sprint for 50 meters. That's a conversation perhaps for another time. But we not only try to include max velocity training, we try to progress max velocity training over the duration of a high school interscholastic sporting experience.
I was going to stop us there, but this last question, we have to answer. It says, help, I've only got 6 weeks for my entire season. What should be paramount in my training?
So what should be paramount in your training? Just follow that 2-week cycle. Do the basic distance runs, do the medium, long, and long run, one every 2 weeks, do a threshold session every week, and do the strides, if you would please. They don't have to be sprints or max velocity. Do the strides at, for example, 3,200 meter goal pace and or 1,600 meter goal pace, whatever's safe and manageable. Do the strides on almost every day, if not every day. In other words, do the basic cardiovascular work and do the basic neuromuscular work, and don't worry about, for now, the plyometric training, the stadium step ascent training, the hill sprint training, the hurdle mobility training. You don't have to worry about that necessarily right now if you only have 6 weeks. But the one caveat I would also interject, if I may, don't overdo it. Don't overdo it. Don't feel so compelled to push your student athletes in that 6-week time period that you injure them. Always better to be a little undertrained than ever to be overtrained, because when you're overtrained, your training is over. So protect them, do the best you can in 6 weeks, include the foundational cardiovascular and neuromuscular components, leave it at that for this 6-week period, and then regroup and plan for that full training cycle that will accompany the upcoming summer and fall, pandemic willing.
Wow, that was a great 20 minutes right there. I tell you, outstanding. Jeff, thank you so much. Would you share real quick your email with folks, please?
Let me put that up right now, Tim. I'll do that gladly. If you can indulge me for about 10 seconds. And oops. Hang with me, my friend. There we go. There we go. There we go. Tim, should be available.
It is.
Good. Very good. So that's my cellular telephone number. Don't take advantage of me. I'm blessed with a young daughter who's just less than a year old, so I try to commit as much time as I can to my daughter and my wife. But reach out to me via text if you'd like to, for starters, and then we can follow with a telephone conversation. Reach out to me via electronic mail anytime. I'm very active on electronic mail, typically respond within 24 hours, worst case scenario. Try to respond within 6 to 12 hours whenever I have the opportunity.
Thank you so much. Again, if you can't reach Jeff, you can also reach me and I'll share that with you. Jeff, I can't thank you enough. That was outstanding. Jeff will be back the next 2 Tuesdays, and we'll tie all that together. Again, if you're not quite sure, it all ties up at the end. It really does come together. So please join us the next couple of weeks. Jeff, thank you once again. Really do appreciate it very much.
Thank you, Tim. Thanks to all my colleagues for the privilege of being with you. I wish you a great evening. Stay safe, stay well, and I hope to see all of you next Tuesday. Thank you again.
All right. Well, hey, if you want to join us in 15 minutes, we'll be back at 8 o'clock with our second session of the night. Cameron Gary will be here, and we'll be talking about the long jump and the triple jump. All you have to do is go back to the website, do that quick registration where you put your name and password, or your name and email, and you're in. And remember, every time you watch a session live, you get in the drawing VIP for the 2022 relays. So once again, thank you so much, everyone. A good night to you all. Hopefully we'll see you in about 15 minutes with a longer triple jump, but if not, either tomorrow night or in one of the next sessions. Once again, good night, everybody. Thank you very much.